This episode is brought to you by HASA. Liquid is clearly better. Liquid chlorine is the highest purity, works immediately, has no added cyanuric acid or calcium, and it will leave your pool safe, clean, and clear. And by the bottom feeder professional grade battery powered vacuum system. It sucks to clean pools, so cleaning pools sucks less. Get $100 off with code DVB100.
This episode is brought to you by Skimmer, the #1 pool service software in North America. With Skimmer, you can streamline your schedule, grow your revenue, and keep your customers coming back with 5-star service. Whether you're a one-person operation or an established team, Skimmer is your partner in success. Visit getskimmer.com/poolguy to try Skimmer for free for 30 days.
The Pool Guy Podcast Show. The Pool Guy Podcast Show. The Pool Guy Podcast Show.
Hi, welcome to the Pool Guy Podcast Show. Here's another back to the basics, and I'm going to talk about balancing chlorine. And this is free chlorine, combined chlorine, total chlorine, and the Breakpoint Chlorination. A lot of you maybe haven't taken the CPO course where they cover some of this there, and I'm going to go over this with you here so you get an idea of how to manage this with your own backyard pool or on your pool route. Are you a pool service pro looking to take your business to the next level? Join the Pool Guy coaching program. Get expert advice, business tips, exclusive content, and get direct support from me. I'm a 35-year veteran in the industry. Whether you're starting out or scaling up, I've got the tools to help you succeed. Learn more at swimmingpoollearning.com. A lot of times you're going to hear someone say you should keep this chlorine level, but in reality there are 3 components to this statement. You have your free chlorine, and you have your combined chlorine, and you have your total chlorine. So these are 3 things, and the way this kind of works is that your total chlorine equals your free chlorine plus combined chlorine. And a lot of test kits do test for this. There are the DPD or fast DPD test kits that do that. A lot of the photometers test for this as well. Some of the test strips you are using, if you use like a 7-way test strip, it should have a combined chlorine also on that strip, although it's harder to get the exact number because you're kind of looking at it and kind of guessing. And also the Taylor or reagent test kit has a way to get your total chlorine by testing for combined chlorine. Why is it important to test for this? Well, there's a lot of reasons why you should be doing a full test at a pool and finding out if there's any combined chlorine in the water. Sometimes it's obvious. You can kind of smell the kind of ammonia smell coming from the pool, and that's a good indication that there's some combined chlorine. Another indication, of course, is if the water is a little bit cloudy, there's probably combined chlorine in there, but you won't know unless you test the water for that. So what is combined chlorine? Combined chlorine is chlorine that's already reacted with contaminants in the pool like sweat, urine, oil, organic materials, and basically when the free chlorine combines with that, it creates, and you probably heard this word, chloramines. And this compound is kind of, again, responsible for that unpleasant smell. It almost smells like Windex, skin irritation, eye discomfort. So if someone complains about swimming and they're saying, hey, my eyes are burning in the pool, this happens a lot in commercial pools. When I did commercial pool service, I got a lot of this, and that's because there was combined chlorine in the water. When you have a lot of people in there and a lot of contaminants, people don't rinse before they get in the pool. They have suntan lotion. Of course, that's going to cause irritation with your eyes and skin. So unlike free chlorine, which is actively sanitizing, and I'm going to describe free chlorine for you also, but I wanted to touch on combined chlorine because when you say that, people don't really know what that is, even though in the word itself, it kind of explains it. The chlorine is combined with kind of the junk in the pool and is used up. So high levels of combined chlorine will definitely use up a lot of the free chlorine in the pool. And that's why they talk about breakpoint chlorination. And this breaks down the chloramines and, removes the combined chlorine in the pool basically. And this, the ideal parts per million that most people will state is 0.2 parts per million of combined chlorine or less. And that means that it's pretty much free of combined chlorine at that point. Let me back up and we'll talk about free chlorine. And this is another word you may hear is active chlorine. You're going to hear this term used in the industry as well. So free chlorine is kind of the active chlorine. And this is the chlorine that is at the highly effective state. It is used to sanitize the water, breaks down contaminants, and it kills bacteria, takes care of algae. And then, of course, free chlorine is something that you need in the water to make sure that it's safe to swim in. What is the ideal free chlorine level? Well, a lot of places will state 1 to 3 parts per million. I think those are really low free chlorine levels in my opinion. And I think you should have a good target free chlorine level of 5 parts per million. That means that every day the chlorine level should not drop below 5 parts per million in the water. And there are some reasons to keep it higher, of course. And if you heard the other podcasts I've done, and I don't want to go into this too much because it's going to sidetrack you, but there is a formula for free chlorine equaling the amount of cyanuric acid in the water times 7.5. So briefly, if your cyanuric acid level is 100 parts per million times 7.5, you're going to need 7.5 parts per million of free chlorine in the water for it to be effective. How does cyanuric acid level affect the free chlorine level in the pool? Well, it directly impacts the free chlorine because it's a stabilizer that helps protect the chlorine from being broken down by the sun's UV rays. But a really high level of cyanuric acid, say 150 or 200 parts per million, makes the chlorine less effective, or it works slower. It's not really locked up. There was like chlorine lock was a term we used back in the day, but it does make the chlorine less effective because it slows down the chlorine's ability to actually work in the pool. And if you listen to Terry Arco or Bob Lowry when they were on my podcast, they do talk about that 97% of the free chlorine is bound to the cyanuric acid. And the higher the level, the harder it is for the chlorine to work rapidly in the pool. So, chlorine will be more effective if the cyanuric acid level is at 50 parts per million versus 200 parts per million. So just know that the higher the cyanuric acid level goes in the pool, the less effective the free chlorine level is, which means you have to have more free chlorine in the pool to be effective. And that's why that formula that Bob Lowry came up with is so important, because it's no longer 1 to 3 parts per million. The target range of 5 parts per million is pretty safe, but in reality, if you do have 100 parts per million of cyanuric acid, you're going to need 7.5% of free chlorine in the pool for it to be effective. So if that makes sense, the higher the cyanuric acid level, the higher the free chlorine level. If your cyanuric acid level is at 200 parts per million, if this pool has been using tablets, trichlor tablets, and it's just been being loaded up every summer for 2 or 3 years, and you're at 200 parts per million, you're going to need around 14 or 15 parts per million of free chlorine for that to be effective. So I hope that makes sense, that the higher the cyanuric acid level, the more free chlorine you're going to need in the pool. Contrary, on the other side of that, if you keep the cyanuric acid level too low, and I found that 30 parts per million is pretty low in Southern California, in my area, it would be kind of ridiculous in Texas and Las Vegas to keep it at 30 parts per million. You need more like 70 or 80 because the sun's UV rays are so strong and the UV index is so high that it's going to burn that chlorine off rapidly. So cyanuric acid does play an important part in slowing down the chlorine burn off in the pool, and too little is going to make you use a lot of product to keep the chlorine level up. You're going to be adding it to the pool constantly. Too high of a level, a partial drain would be logical if it's at 150 or 200, or even at 100, you may want to lower it to 80 parts per million. The only reason that you want to keep an eye on that is because, again, the more cyanuric acid, the less effective the chlorine is in the pool. So now that you know a little bit about combined chlorine and free chlorine, what is total chlorine? Well, the name actually explains what it is. It's the measure of the total chlorine level in the pool, and it's basically getting the free chlorine level plus the combined chlorine level, and this will give you your total chlorine level, and this will give you a number, and this number is the breakpoint of the combined chlorine in the pool. So basically, you're going to test for your free chlorine, and then you're going to test for combined chlorine. And depending on what test you're using, if you're using the Taylor kit, you're going to have to do a total chlorine test. If you have a photometer like the Lamont Color Q 2X Pro 7 or 2X Pro 9, you use a reagent to test for combined chlorine, and then the photometer will give you the total chlorine in the pool. So this is really handy to have a photometer, especially if you're doing commercial pools. It'll give you that combined chlorine level and the total chlorine, and that way you can do the breakpoint Do you have to do this at every pool? Well, kind of yes and no. In the summertime, if the pool is being used, especially a commercial pool, yes, you have to do it every week or every time you visit, which is more than once a week in most cases, I should say. But in a backyard pool, if the pool's out of season and the water temperature is cooler, there's not a lot of reason to do a total chlorine or a combined chlorine reading in the pool. In my opinion, this is only done when the pool is being used in the summertime mainly, and there's certain clients on your pool route that never get in their pool. You know who they are. They don't use their pool, period. Is it really important to do this? Well, if the pool's not being used, logically, there's not a lot of space there for combined chlorine to form in the pool. This happens usually with pools that are being used a lot. So I wouldn't bother too much on a pool that's never being used. If you have clients that never use their pool, it's not super important to do this. But for pools that are being used heavily or used often, you definitely want to do this so that you can tackle the combined chlorine, because it can get out of hand in a pool very rapidly, and you want to make sure you get a handle on it. So how do you handle combined chlorine? Well, there's actually a breakpoint, and people talk about shocking your pool weekly. If you go into a pool store, a lot of them will say, well, you have to add shock to your pool every week. In a sense, that's true. In a sense, that's not true. I'll explain it this way. They're covering their bases, basically. If you talk to someone in a pool store and you go in there with a water sample, and let's say they do notice some combined chlorine, or they don't notice any combined chlorine, they may just say shock your pool, because shocking your pool will not do any harm to the pool. In fact, it'll benefit the pool, because then you're raising the chlorine level up, and if there is any combined chlorine, it's going to destroy it and eliminate it. So saying that is a good answer, because chances are there's combined chlorine in there. Chances are their test shows something that's a little elevated. Chances are the test doesn't show any elevation in it, but might as well shock it to prevent combined chlorine from forming in the pool. So you kind of see that this answer is not wrong in itself, but it is not a clear answer, because you really don't need to shock a pool, in my opinion, unless there is some combined chlorine in the pool, because you're just wasting product. And if you're adding maintenance dose of chemicals for your customer and you just keep adding shock and adding chlorine, it's going to run your costs up to a level to where you're going to be losing money in your pool service business. Frankly, you're not going to be making any money if you don't watch your chemical costs. And so when do you shock a pool? Well, you shock a pool if the free chlorine level drops below an amount that you have set based on a 7.5% formula, or if the target range is 5 parts per million and you test it as at 2 parts per million, we definitely want to bring it back up to 5 parts per million, so you're going to shock the pool. If you do a test and there's some combined chlorine, you want to do a breakpoint on that. So how do you do a breakpoint of that? We have to add enough chlorine. You can use a non-chlorine shock as well if you wanted to, and non-chlorine shocks are pretty good at breaking some of the combined chlorine in the pool. Non-chlorine shock does have its place. What I like to use it for is, before there's a pool party, I'll give a customer 1 or 2 bags of this. They're 1 pound bags. You can buy them in 1 pound bags, or you can buy them in a 25-pound bucket or a 50-pound bucket. I like the bags because you can give it to a customer. They can add it before the pool party. And these are typically potassium monosulfate. MPS is the abbreviation for it, and that's the main ingredient. Potassium monosulfate is an oxidizer, so it breaks down the contaminants in the water. So it does work effectively if you wanted to use a non-chlorine shock with a chlorine shock, but it may not be cost effective. These are pretty expensive now. Back in the day when, I think in the early 2000s, these were dirt cheap, this non-chlorine shock. So I would use it all the time because it was so inexpensive, but I don't know what happened, but something happened to the price point, like everything else, of course, in the industry, and it just skyrocketed in price to where it's really not cost effective, in my opinion, to use it. I just would rather just use chlorine at this point, but you can use this as well. The only time, again, that I use this is to give a customer 1 or 2 bags before a pool party. It seems to help a lot, especially before the party starts, if they drop it in the pool. The breakpoint is really easy to calculate. It's just 10 times the combined chlorine number. So I'll give you a pretty real life example, and this is why sometimes when you're trying to clear up a cloudy pool, it's ineffective. There are a few other things with a cloudy pool. Number 1, you may need to backwash or clean the filter. And number 2, you want to run this pool for 24 or 48 hours to clear it out. But let's say you tested for combined chlorine and it's coming back at 2 parts per million. Well, this means that you have to add 20 parts per million of chlorine to break it. A lot of times you're going to shock the pool and just add 10 parts per million. That's not going to do it because you have to do 10 times of the combined chlorine level to actually break it. So if you're at 5 parts per million of combined chlorine, which is not unheard of, by the way, after a pool party when there's 20 Boy Scouts in the pool and none of them take a bathroom break, you kind of know where that goes. You have to add 50 parts per million of chlorine to the pool. Now that sounds like an astronomical amount of chlorine to add to a pool, but in reality, it's not really an astronomical amount. It's just an amount that's going to break the combined chlorine. And typically your free chlorine is going to be at 0 as well in a case like this. So let's say that your combined chlorine is 2 parts per million and you want to break that. I'll give you an example here of a 15,000 gallon pool. So you get to this pool, it's cloudy, you do the test, the combined chlorine comes out at 2 parts per million, and you want to break this in a 15,000 gallon pool. Let's say you're using 12.5% liquid chlorine in the pool and you want to break this. You want to add it to 20 parts per million of chlorine. You're going to use a little bit over 2 gallons. So I would say about 2.5 gallons of liquid chlorine. And if you're in Florida, that's kind of a 2.5 gallon jug is what you're carrying around. And so you would pour that whole 2.5 gallon jug in the pool. And that should break the combined chlorine and bring it back down to 0. Run the pool for 24 hours, maybe clean the filter, and then your pool should be back to normal. It's not really, an amount of chlorine that's unheard of. Now, if it's at 50 parts per million, of course, you're going to probably have to add 5. Actually, I'll give you the exact amount. That way you don't make a mistake here because I mentioned you have to be pretty exact here to break it. So in a 15,000 gallon pool, if the combined chlorine is 5 parts per million, you have to add 6 gallons of 12.5% liquid chlorine to break it. That's a lot of chlorine at that point because you're at 5 parts per million. Hopefully you never experience anything that high. Most of the time, your combined chlorine is 1 or 2, and you're bringing the pool to 10 to 20 parts per million, and you're going to break that combined chlorine. If you don't break that combined chlorine, it becomes even more combined, I guess, and it gets harder and harder to break it. So as soon as you find out that you have chloramines in the pool, shock the pool, which is what the pool store will tell you to do because it makes sense. It doesn't hurt anything. And of course, they sell product, and bring that chlorine level, but up to a certain point that needs to break that combined chlorine. You can add chlorine to a shock level. Again, if your combined chlorine was 2 parts per million, you just added enough chlorine for 10 parts per million. You didn't break it. And so it's still there, and it's still going to make the free chlorine ineffective. And you may be wondering, well, why didn't the pool clear up? Why do I still smell that ammonia? Because you didn't add enough chlorine to the pool. So it's really important to test for it and have an accurate number. If you have to take it into a pool store, go for it, take it in there and see how much combined chlorine, because usually they have a photometer that can give you the exact amount of combined chlorine. In that case, realistically, you're not going to face a lot of huge combined chlorine numbers out there. Maybe it's 0.5, and that's kind of a typical amount of combined, or 0.3. Let's just say it's 0.5. 10 times that is 5 parts per million. So in a 15,000 gallon pool, you're going to add 3 quarts of liquid chlorine at 12.5% strength. Not a lot of chlorine, but that'll break the combined chlorine. So any number, even small, you have to bring up the free chlorine level to that breaking point of that. And of course, having a good test kit that could show you how to do that or give you that number is important. So what's a good combined chlorine level? Well, if you're using a Lamont photometer, then your free chlorine level is, let's say, 3, and then your combined chlorine is at 0, and then your total chlorine would be 3. And so basically, if the number total chlorine is the same as the free chlorine, then you don't have any combined chlorine in the pool, and that's a good number. So don't get scared when you are using a photometer or if someone gives you a number. And this is something that's critical. I want to make sure you understand this. You test for free chlorine, you test for combined chlorine, and then you get your total chlorine. And so if your total chlorine is 3, you don't have to shock the pool because your free chlorine was 3 as well. That means there's no combined chlorine. Don't make the mistake of doing the total chlorine and it's 3. This happens a lot out there too, and I've had people make this mistake or not understand it. So basically, your total chlorine is your free chlorine plus your combined chlorine, and that's your total. And if your free chlorine again is 3 parts per million, and then your total chlorine is 3 parts per million, that means that you're fine. Everything is good. Now, if you test the pool and your free chlorine is 3 parts per million, and your total chlorine comes out at 3.5 parts per million, that means that you have 0.5 parts per million of combined chlorine, and you have to do the breakpoint for that 0.5. Again, if you're using a photometer like the Color Q 2X Pro 7 or 2X Pro 9, you're going to do a free chlorine reading. It's going to show you 3. Then it's going to show you 0.5 combined chlorine. And then when you get the total chlorine, it's going to come out at 3.5. So the closer those numbers match, the free chlorine and total chlorine, means that you're in a good spot. And if the total chlorine is 3.2, that means that your free chlorine is 3, that you have a slight amount of combined chlorine in the pool. In most cases, if you're maintaining the pool correctly, if there's not a huge bather load, you're going to have the free chlorine and total chlorine come out the same. And that's why you have to do this test, because you want to make sure that the free chlorine is effective in the pool and there's not a lot of combined chlorine in the pool making the free chlorine ineffective. Looking for other podcasts, you can find those on my website, swimmingpoollearning.com. On the banner, click on the podcast icon. There'll be a drop-down menu of over 1,600 podcasts there for you as well. And if you're interested in the coaching program that I offer, you can learn more at poolguycoaching.com. Thanks for listening to this podcast. Have a great rest of your week. God bless. This episode is brought to you by HASA, providing products that deliver clean, healthy water for every aspect of everyday life. The bottom feeder battery-powered vacuum system, portable, powerful, and only weighs 12 pounds. And Skimmer. Get Skimmer, America's #1 pool service software. Podcast listeners can try Skimmer for free at getskimmer.com/poolguy.